Thank you, Arnie, for joining us. Arnie Gundersen is the chief engineer at Fairwinds Associates, is a nuclear engineer and a former nuclear industry executive with more than 51 years of nuclear industry experience in engineering, operations, and safety analysis. Mr. Gundersen and his wife Maggie, are the founder of Fairwinds, became nuclear whistleblowers in 1990. Fairwinds has written dozens of expert reports for legal cases and non-government and nonprofit organizations worldwide. Mr. Gundersen is also a co-author of 3 major international peer-reviewed scientific papers documenting the contamination of environments by migrating radioactive microparticles of dust and dirt. Thank you, Mr. Gundersen, for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me, and a shout out to the organizers and to Dr. Nolan, who I was really excited to hear, and hopefully she'll come back, and to Mary Olson too. I'm pleased to be on the panel. So my discussion, I will focus on tritium, how it's produced, and what can be done about it. I need to start, before I talk about tritium, I need to start about nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is a uranium atom is a huge atom. It has 235 protons and neutrons in it. And it's when it splits, not in half, but when it splits apart, it gives an enormous amount of energy. And we all know that. That's what makes bombs. That's what makes nuclear reactors. The heat of splitting a uranium atom in half or in parts is what is the huge advantage to nuclear fission. But the disadvantage is that this stuff left behind, this radioactive rubble, is 1, radioactive, and 2, physically hot. So what that means is that after about 3 years, the nuclear fuel has so much radioactive rubble that it can't be used anymore. And it's moved into the spent fuel pool. So the spent fuel pool has 3 purposes. The first is it keeps this radioactive rubble cool. The second is that it shields the people working above from the radiation from the radioactive rubble. And there's 20 feet of water over this stuff to shield the workers that are above it. It's highly radioactive. And the third is that it contains boron to avoid the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction starting up again. So the 3 purposes of a fuel pool are to cool, to shield, and to prevent a chain reaction. So that's the big atom, that's the uranium atom. Now let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum and talk about hydrogen. The hydrogen is the smallest atom, and it's got 1 proton. Let's see if I can do this right. 1 proton and an electron that goes around it. It has a weight of 1 compared to 235. So that 1 proton has a positive charge, the electron's negative, and it goes around. Well, sometimes hydrogen mutates and becomes tritium. And tritium still has that 1 proton, but it has 2 neutral charge neutrons as well. It's 3 times heavier than the initial hydrogen atom, but it still has that 1 electron that zips around it. And so chemically, tritium is no different than hydrogen. They both have 1 electron to cause the chemical reactions. So it's also unstable. That means it's radioactive. So hydrogen is not, hydrogen stays in its form, but tritium decays over time. Now, what does that mean? It's unstable. It means that on average, within 12 years, half of it will disappear. Half of it will decay away. And in the process, it'll give off a radioactive bullet. And that bullet is called a beta particle. While it exists, it can form chemical bonds with other atoms. So tritium is a form of hydrogen. There's no difference in it. chemically, but it weighs more, but it behaves like hydrogen chemically. So for instance, let's assume that this is a water molecule. We got an H and an H and an O, H2O, okay? Now, what happens with tritium is that one of those becomes heavier. It's a tritium and a hydrogen and oxygen, and it's called HTO. So tritiated water is water that has one tritium, one hydrogen, and one oxygen, whereas tritium is just a standalone atom of hydrogen. What's in the fuel pool at Indian Point is tritiated water, a tritium, a hydrogen, and an oxygen molecule. The other thing that a tritium can do is it can hook up with a carbon atom, and there's 4 hydrogens and a large carbon atom, and one of those can be radioactive, and that's called organically bound tritium, and that's even worse than tritiated water. There's a good discussion. I think it'll be in a link to this presentation on the Fairwinds website with Dr. Ian Fairley. Maggie and I and one of the Fairwinds staff talked with Dr. Fairley for about 40 minutes on his concerns about tritium, and he's an international expert, and I really won't go too far on that. Now, it's important to remember that tritium occurs naturally. Tritium is formed as cosmic rays bombard the Earth, and about 1 in a quadrillion atoms of tritium in water are tritiated water. 1 in a quadrillion atoms in water are tritium naturally. That's the natural background on Earth because cosmic rays are creating it. Now, the EPA limit for tritium is 750 times higher than that. Now, you'll hear terms thrown around about 20,000 picocuries per liter, concentrations and stuff like that. What I like to deal with is something called a becquerel, and 1 becquerel is a disintegration every second. So in nature, a liter, you know what a liter bottle is, right? A liter of water in nature, just go up in the Catskills and take a nice bottle of water out of one of the freshwater streams. That will be disintegrating at 1 disintegration every second from the natural occurring tritium that's coming down from the sky. Now, the EPA limit would say that it's acceptable to drink that bottle if it had 740 disintegrations per second. The water in the fuel pool is hotter still, and it is more radioactive. And so and that water in that pool has been there for 50 years. So over time, where does tritium come from? It's naturally made. We talked about that, but it's also man-made in nuclear reactors. One of the products of the nuclear chain reaction is tritium. It's called a tertiary product. But the other part of it is it comes from boron. So the boron that's in the pool, to prevent the chain reaction from occurring, creates more tritium. And the boron that's in the reactor coolant creates more tritium as well. So the tritium concentration in the pool is much higher than the tritium concentration that EPA would let you drink, and the EPA limit is 700 times higher than what Mother Nature has in the water. Now, the health effects of tritium are something that hopefully the other speakers may touch on. And again, I refer you to Dr. Ian Fairley and the extensive interview that Maggie and I had with Dr. Fairley about tritium. But let me say this: the nuclear industry says that tritium is a weak beta emitter. And what that means is that its radioactive bullet is weaker than something like cesium or strontium or something like that. But what they don't tell you is that it still can travel more than the length of a DNA double helix. So if a water molecule is next to a DNA double helix and it decays, that tritium, that beta particle, even though it's weak, even though it doesn't travel real far, is going to hit that double helix and destroy it and do genetic damage. So the spent fuel pool we already talked about has 1 million gallons or more of tritiated water in it, whose concentration is thousands of times higher than the EPA allows. Now, I did a paper, Fairwinds did a paper, Maggie and I did a paper for Hudson Riverkeeper. And we looked at the tritium releases from Indian Point. Of course, Unit 1 had a leaky fuel pool and has leaked not just tritium, but strontium and cesium into the groundwater around the plant. Now, because you're not drinking that water, the EPA limits don't apply, but it's higher than the EPA limits. Unit 2 has also had a leak in the fuel pool. And again, next to the buildings, there's tritium in the soil at concentrations that are higher than the EPA would let you drink. But because it's an owner-controlled situation, the EPA doesn't seem to mind. But there's a couple of interesting phenomena that I discovered in the report for Riverkeeper. And that's that the fuel pool evaporates. Not the water just isn't just static. Some water evaporates into the atmosphere and gets sucked out through fans out the plant stack. Now remember, tritium can't be treated. It's chemically identical to water. So they have found, this is Entergy found, tritium in puddles on the site. Now, where did that came from? It came out the site, and they call the phenomena rain out, where the tritium then lays on the soil and forms tritiated water on the site. They also found it in the condensate from air conditioners. You know, when you walk by an air conditioner in the summer and it drips, well, that's concentrating the water that's in the air. And of course, if there's tritium in the air, there's going to be tritium in the condensate. So for several decades now, Indian Point has been releasing tritiated water directly into the atmosphere around the plant. This happened at Vermont Yankee as well, and every other power plant in the country releases on order of 5,000 gallons of tritiated water a day during refueling outages. So, you have a school nearby. It would have been important to sample the runoff on a humid day, not a rainy day, but a humid day where you get the water on your windshield or something like that, and look for tritium. But the NRC doesn't require it, and of course the licensees aren't going to want that to happen. Now, how is the fuel pool treated? If you look at those fuel pools, the water is beautiful. It's crystal clear. Well, they filter it and take all the dust out that may be in it. And then they basically connect it to a fancy Brita filter, much larger, but the concept is the same. They take out the ionic things, the chemicals like cesium and strontium, but they can't take out tritium, because tritium is tritiated water is water. So it flows right through. There's no way to separate out the tritium from the tritiated water from all the water in the fuel pool. Let me just catch up on myself here. Okay, so then the question is, what are you going to do about it? And there's 3 alternatives. It can't be filtered. And even there's other radioactive material in the pool that can be filtered out. And the filters get about 90, maybe 95% of that. They don't get it all. So a release of the spent fuel pool won't just release tritiated water. It will release other things like, cesium and strontium. Strontium's a bone seeker, causes a lot of leukemia and brain cancers, and cesium is a muscle seeker. So the filtration is not going to take it out. But there's three solutions. The first solution is the cheap one, the one that Holtec wants to do, and that's dump it into the Hudson River. There's this old adage we had in the nuclear industry: dilution is the solution to pollution. But the fact of the matter is they plan to dump 1 million gallons of radioactive water into the Hudson and count that at some point downstream or upstream, it's going to dilute with the Hudson River flow and not be measurable. It is measurable in the pool, and it will be 700 times higher than Mother Nature's limit if it's released at the EPA limit. And I'm not convinced the EPA limit is safe. Again, we'll take a look at Dr. Fairley's report on that. So number one, dilution is a solution to pollution. That's the cheap way, and that's the way Holtec wants to go. The second way is what they did at Vermont Yankee. Vermont Yankee, because Vermont has very tough environmental laws, was a zero liquid discharge plant. It discharged nothing into the river. And what Vermont Yankee did was they shipped the radioactive tritiated water in tanker trucks down to a licensed facility in Tennessee. That's open to Holtec, but it costs money. So they can move it by tanker truck to an NRC licensed facility. And they've chosen just financially not to do that. So, and the third option is keep the fuel pool. There's two reasons to keep the fuel pool. One is when Entergy was making money, and Con Ed before them, they had the pool for 50 years, and it didn't seem to be a hindrance. Now, they were making money, and the fuel pool was part of that money-making venture. Well, now with Holtec, Holtec makes money by knocking things down. So it's not in Holtec's, not the Holtec's advantage to keep that pool functioning. But one, it doesn't release the tritium, and in about 120 years, that's 10 half-lives, 12-year half-life times 10, about 120 years, there will be 1,000th of the tritium that's there right now today remaining. And at that point, it's essentially could be released. But the second reason is that the NRC does not require you to have a facility if a fuel cask were to be breached or to start to leak or to develop a crack. There's no requirement for the NRC to have anything to do with that fuel cask. Now, if the spent fuel pool was still there, it could be put back into that facility where it could be worked on in a controlled manner. So I've been an advocate out in California and elsewhere to keep the fuel pool until there's a point when the fuel is ultimately sent to a radiological repository. So you can dump it, that's the cheapest. You can truck it, which is more expensive, or you can keep the fuel pool and let the stuff decay. And frankly, either of those last two alternatives, to my mind, are better than what Holtec is proposing.